Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Solidarity Live. We are closing out one of the most eventful Januaries I've ever experienced. Inaugurations, civil war, pandemic. Some of these events are better than others, but either way, we're so excited to be here with you this morning. Hi, Alex. How are you doing?
Hi, Jocelyn. Grading on the curve of being stuck in a pandemic, doing pretty well. I agree with your assessment about this January being it's very 2020, actually. It feels very
strong
2020
energy.
But I wanted to, we talked with Ari a couple shows ago about the coup attempt on January 6th and the extremist elements. And we talked then about how when I worked at Media Matters with Ari, I had a team. Our team exposed the media mainstreaming a lot of these extremist ideas. And today we're joined by David Holthouse, who was the reporter on that team, who just did amazing work there at Media Matters, but also before and after. And David's sort of beat was exposing white nationalist and extremist groups. He actually went undercover, exposing extremist groups for years, with both in a series with Village Voice Media and the alt weeklies, and then over to Southern Poverty Law Center, and then to the Media Matters team, exposing that nexus of how right-wing media was taking and mainstreaming this stuff that was just horribly violent and anti-democratic, and bringing it slowly but surely into the Republican mainstream. And I think that you could see a direct path. We could see it at the time from there to what happened on January 6th. So I'm happy to have David Holthouse joining us today on Solidarity Live. David, how are you?
Doing great, maintaining sanity and sustaining optimism.
Oh, that's the best.
That's the best answer ever, actually. I love it.
Yeah, I think you win on that. Although I did hear one other, Kristen Rao Finkbeiner, who's the executive director of Moms Rising, when people asked how she was doing in the middle of the pandemic, her answer was medium rare.
That's nice.
And I felt that one was really good. I was like, yes, I feel that. So I don't know. I'd love to talk about sort of like your expertise. Like you literally went undercover exposing the extremist movements in this country for years. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I first got into it in 2003, and I was a reporter for Village Voice Media, which, as you mentioned, was a chain of alt weeklies. And I was known for doing pretty gonzo stunt journalism assignments. And the ADL got a hold of the Westward, the paper in Denver where I was based, and asked the editor, do you have a reporter that might be interested in sort of a crash course in how to go undercover as a neo-Nazi skinhead, because you've got a major neo-Nazi gathering coming up in the Denver area. And my editor, Patty Calhoun, was like, yeah, I got the guy for you. So I spent a couple of weeks with an investigator from the Anti-Defamation League, and she trained me in how to walk and talk like a neo-Nazi skinhead. And at the time, I thought this was just going to be a one-off. But the minute I sort of stepped behind the curtain of that movement, I was immediately stunned by really how well organized and well funded it was. I was like, this is a much bigger deal than most people in America understand. This is not the stereotype of some dysfunctional youth like listening to bad punk rock music and occasionally stomping somebody, or just a bunch of backwoods hicks burning crosses and getting drunk from time to time. This is actually a movement. And so I then started, whenever there was a neo-Nazi gathering in a city where one of the papers in my chain was based, I would sort of parachute in and go undercover and report on it. That brought me to the attention of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they contacted me, and they were essentially like, hey, you want to come do this full time for us? And at that time, George Bush Jr. had just been reelected, and I was looking to do something more sort of ideologically focused with my work. And I said, yeah. And so then from 2005 to 2010, I worked for the Southern Poverty Law Center, reporting for their magazine Intelligence Report. And really, you know, when I went to the SPLC, there were a lot of people, friends and colleagues that were like, why would you go spend your time and talent on that, you know? And I take no pleasure in having been proven right, no pun intended, for what's happened in the last decade and a half with that movement. I mean, I saw it coming in 2003, you know? Yeah. You know, and then Alex, when you and I started working together at Media Matters, this guy, Daryl Johnson from the Department of Homeland Security, had just gotten like thrown under the bus by DHS for publishing a report. Like Janet Napolitano just like threw him under the bus because he published a report saying, hey, DHS is identifying right-wing extremists as the most significant terrorist threat in the United States. And, you know, the GOP went into an uproar about it and got this guy fired, and it basically just got all buried. So, yeah, you know, I'm sure he's probably also taking no pleasure in being right. So, yeah, that's how I got it anyway.
That is how we started, was like, right, that was like the starting clock. We pulled our team together right as that went down, and it was crazy to balance that with what we were seeing, which was like, this is becoming more and more and more mainstream, and then they pull this report, and more and more and more mainstream, but still horribly violent, right? It's not like they toned down what they said, and it actually had an amplifying effect, if I can delve back in my memories for it. And then Jocelyn, I'll stop talking as much, but remember Glenn Beck was big at that time, and what he would do is he's like Tucker Carlson's producer just got outed as like a white nationalist, right? Like he's a Nazi, and he was writing this stuff in. Somewhere in Glenn Beck's world, there's someone like that who was putting like literal white nationalist talking points into Glenn Beck. And so you'd start hearing this stuff, you know, and basically he'd get his whiteboard out and he'd just leave off, you know, like he wouldn't say Zog, Zionist occupied government, which is what the white nationalists call it, but he'd paint the exact same picture, right? And he'd leave that. Right. And what that actually did in the extremist movement is it didn't make them moderate. They'd see a lot of their ideas on TV, and sort of their identity as extremists is to be more extreme than what is the acceptable thing. So when this, you know, like white nationalism became acceptable, and they made it sort of like the friendly, cuddlier Nazis right. on Glenn Beck, it actually made the extremists more violent, more outspoken, because they were seeing that, you know, the shift, and it was a vicious cycle. So that just kept happening, and it just moved along. And I think QAnon is sort of a where it is right now. You have it's loosely affiliated. You still have all the white nationalist groups, but it's sort of coalesced into this thing, which again is sort of accepted as mainstream. They have members of Congress who are openly saying that they are QAnon supporters, which is literally the same as saying I'm a white nationalist. Like, it's saying I believe that there is going to be an event where all my enemies are going to die. They're going to be killed. And, you know, in QAnon, they call it the storm, but in just normal old Nazi, they called it the day of the rope. And can you talk about something you said that I have the same feelings? When a decade ago, when we were looking at it, it still seemed pretty far away, right? Like you could find that.
Yeah, at the SPLC, we used to get these, you know, these threat calls. It would basically go something like this: "Look, you race traitor, Jew-loving, you know, scum. When we get control of this government, you know, we're keeping a list, and when we get control of this government on the day of the rope, you know, you're going up against the wall, right?" And we used to laugh that off. frankly. But that has, in recent years, and especially in recent weeks, that's been a lot less funny for me personally. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that movement. Do you agree with that sort of mainstream?
I mean, the mainstreaming of white nationalist ideology in the media, I mean, it goes back a long way. Like, I remember the first assignment I had for SPLC was to go infiltrate the very first Minuteman border vigilante rally down on the U.S.-Mexico border and determine to what extent hate group members were going to sign up and be a part of this. And what was animating that movement at the time was Lou Dobbs. And at that time, Lou Dobbs was on CNN. Lou Dobbs was a CNN opinion, okay? And he was spouting like vicious anti-immigrant rhetoric on a nightly basis. And he was a hero to that movement. So this goes back a ways and isn't limited to Fox News and One American Network and, you know, these other more recent spin-offs that are even more hard right. You know, it was CNN at the time was animating that movement. So, and, you know, at the Lou Dobbs was a hero both to the hate group members that were there and the people that may have not been card-carrying white nationalists, but who were perfectly willing to rub shoulders with them down on the border, you know, and have these armed encampments. Yeah, and what I figured out on that assignment is, in fact, there was quite a bit of like neo-Nazi participation in that movement. And then that movement, in about when you and I started working together, Alex, in Media Matters, started to morph into the Tea Party movement. I mean, there's a direct line from the Minuteman movement to the Tea Party movement. A lot of the Tea Party chapters were started by Minuteman local chapters. They just like very quickly flipped the switch and went from Minuteman to Tea Party. So.
Well, so David, you know, your writing is wonderful and entertaining and exciting, but it must have been terrifying at certain moments to do, one. And two, I guess for me, so you're doing this, you're putting yourself in an incredibly vulnerable position, not just while you're doing the reporting, but after the fact. Like, this took tremendous risk and bravery. What do you want people to know that you think people don't get? Like, what is so dangerous about these people that you're like putting your life at risk to tell us about it?
I think that if you don't know it at this point, you're not paying attention at all. I mean, when I was doing it, I was trying to expose the Venn diagram where violent right-wing extremists and mainstream conservative politicians overlapped. That was really because we used to call it whack-a-Nazi at the SPLC. Like every time one of them would run for office, or every time someone already holding elected office or in a position of being a power broker for the Republican Party would start to interact with them, we would whack them, like we would expose it. But on the one hand, I think the danger of this movement is more evident right now. On the other, there's no shame now in the GOP in hanging out with these people. I mean, the New York Times broke a story today about all of the members of Congress that are just openly attending right-wing extremist group meetings. And when I say right-wing extremists, I mean groups that are advocating for civil war and racial cleansing. So on the one hand, it's all more out in the open now. I mean, to answer your question, why I was willing to put myself at risk was that I felt like that people needed to understand the potential danger of this movement. But on the one hand, it's all out in the open now, but on the other, it's like there is no whack-a-Nazi now with the GOP because they're not being punished internally for hanging out and supporting these people. So cuts both ways.
It's an interesting point, right? Because it's the information, people have to do things with it. Raw information is, you know, it's just information. Do you have insights about that? How do we unnormalize the Nazis? How do we get back to the whack-a-Nazi era?
I don't, you know, I always just saw it just as my job to just put the information out there. And it's been dispiriting for me to see that like now finally, like what I thought the goal was, which was to make, you know, the America and the world at large, like aware of just how prevalent and dangerous this movement was, to now see that it hasn't led to shame within the GOP to be it's not, they don't even see it. Like we used to, it was catching them. It was catching them out at one of these groups, whether it was like a neo-Confederate group in the South or one of these academic racist groups that we could show like, actually, although these guys wear suit and ties, they're actually like Fourth Reich neo-Nazis. Elected members of the Republican Party would always like express sort of like shame, and they would say that they didn't really understand what sort of gathering they were attending. And now it's just a different set of criteria completely.
So in temporally after Media Matters, you moved on to do other things, and I will just echo with Jocelyn. Everyone should just read Holthouse's pieces. Just Google them and read his stuff, because your writing is amazing. That's
it really is.
That's what makes it so weird. That's what makes you so weird, David, is that you took on this personal risk of death. Like you almost got killed by these people. You write about it, but you write about it with such beauty and like that. It's actually funny sometimes reading your works because you just put this, I don't know what it is into it, but it's genius stuff. And I hope that you realize, as dispiriting as reality is right now, that like we have exposed, and it is a dynamic system. The work that we did, although it didn't end it, is part of this struggle that we find ourselves in, and it's galvanized now in a way that it's never been before. I think none of us could have predicted that you would have had the entire power of the US presidency actually putting on, right? Like that amplification from Donald Trump was just enormous. And I feel like it really caught around the Unite the Right, the big Nazi march in Charlottesville. I think that was a big turning point. And again, you wish that then like everyone stood up and was like, get out of here, Nazis. But we talk about this often. In this country, you actually deal with a whole lot of decent people who have a hard time facing the indecency of reality, right? And so they're like, oh, I can't, it's probably not as bad as people are saying it is. Right? Like, and you're seeing that happen with January 6th with the coup attempt, where people are like trying to just memory hole it into it's not that bad. But on Unite the Right, that one stood out for you as well, right?
Yeah. And what was frustrating about that is that, as with the January 6th coup attempt, insurrection, whatever you want to call it, for weeks beforehand, the Anti-Defamation League, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Global Center Against Hate and Extremism, I mean, any and all of these watchdog groups were flying every red flag they could and ringing every alarm bell they could to local, state, and federal law enforcement saying, hey, there's a tornado coming. And you just see the double standard in terms of like the approach to right-wing extremism versus any other sort of political radicalism or protest movement. I mean, it could not get the feds to listen regarding Charlottesville. On the whole, there was always individual agents that in the federal law enforcement agencies that understand the reality of this threat. But on the whole, you cannot get them to respond. And the same thing played out on January 6th. That came as a surprise to absolutely no one that pays attention to right-wing extremism, that happened and that people died. It was entirely predictable and was predicted. So I guess going back to your question, Jocelyn, though, because I want to come up with a better response, I think that it would be great if the actual ideology of these groups was paid more attention to, and we don't just dig one step beneath the veneer of what they say their ideology is when they're drawing elected GOP representatives to their gatherings. Like, look at what the 3%ers are really saying, what they're really hoping for. Look at the Oath Keepers, like what they talk about when they think it's only themselves talking. Like, that's what you need to pay attention to, and that might move the needle in terms of how the GOP respond.
And it's so hard because I think, what I love about your writing is, as Alex said, it is very entertaining and good writing, which I think might actually be necessary for people when we're talking about these issues, because understandably, there's a psychological response to shut down and be like, oh, but it's just like this little group of people and surely it's never going to happen. Meanwhile, they're storming government buildings with guns. But there is just this tendency to minimize it. Have you faced that when you're doing this work?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, every time you come on the story, always the response is like, well, bro, how bad are they really? Or come on, this is just a bunch of like good old boys that are pro-gun, you know? But you look at what they're talking, what they want is ethnic cleansing of the country and a second civil war that leads to ethnic cleansing in the country. And that just needs to be hammered over and over. That's what these people are about. Whether the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers, any of the white nationalist groups, okay? Like that's what they're about. And a lot of them now, instead of like dressing up like members of the Fourth Reich, they've changed their costuming, and that's helped them to where they've gone to the like Proud Boys look of the, you know, ballistics vests and stuff. So there's not the immediately identifiable symbols, but their ideology is totally clear if you just take a close look at it. And so it's just like it's beyond the pale that you have at least a half a dozen currently sitting members of Congress that are regularly attending meetings and rallies of groups that are advocating for ethnic cleansing. I mean, that's the reality right now. So it's like, again, it's more out in the open, but it's as dangerous as ever because they really are gaining traction within mainstream politics in a way that a decade and a half ago was hard to fathom. But that would be the reality today.
So one of the things that I face this in explaining this often, it's exactly as you say, but if you actually try to walk people through it, and you're like, okay, so Al-Qaeda and the terrorist organizations that terrify so much of this country, their tactics and what they do is very similar to what is espoused in the tactics of the white nationalists, the extremist movements. It's violence. It's violence, and it's violence carried out by individuals that is going to foment more violence. But that's like the entirety of the plan. It's just kill some people so that it inflames a civil war so that we can kill lots of people. And what that leads to, you know, like the Mumbai terror attack was, I think, 6 individuals. I could have the number wrong, but it's you can count them on your 2 hands. And then a bunch of materials that are commercially available in the United States of America. And they shut down the whole city, you know, like they shut it down. That was a massive terror attack. And the extremist movement in this country, the right-wing extremist movement in America, you know, like I think the Timothy McVeigh bombing comes to mind. But the damage that they can do on a sort of individual, I remember a piece that you wrote, David, called Lone Wolves, which I thought, you know, really was that got to that. They radicalize these individual extremists, and then they're operating sort of individually, but with one goal: violence, murdering people.
I'm glad that you brought it back to McVeigh in 1995, because we're in a similar situation in that experts in right-wing extremism have been warning for years, okay, of what was coming, especially after Ruby Ridge. Timothy McVeigh carries out the Oklahoma City bombing and his associates, both known and unknown. And the federal government, in response, cracks down on these groups, infiltrates them, like puts a lot of federal law enforcement resources towards investigating and bringing cases against them and disrupting their activities. So you see a real downtick in right-wing extremism between 1995 and 2001. And then 9/11 happens, and all of the priorities get shifted off of right-wing extremism, white domestic terrorists, okay? And then since then, it was a steady rise all the way up to the present day. So I feel like federal law enforcement is probably back on the case, but it may be, I think it's probably going to be too little too late to prevent some other sort of attack that's intended to be a precipitating event for, you know, the day of the rope and the Second Civil War. You know, I mean, I think that there's a lot of dissension right now within the right-wing extremist movement on whether or not they blew their best shot on January 6th. In other words, they had the US Capitol, and they had armed groups around 7 state capitol buildings around the country. And then they just kind of walked away. They just they allowed themselves to be driven out of the building, and everything just sort of fizzled. So there's a lot of them that are like trying to put a good face on it, but what they really think is they blew it. And then there's some that are desperate to sort of like get the momentum back with some sort of other event that they can all rally around. And I think we're in a very dangerous situation right now.
I love that you bring up the fluctuation, right? Because this is something that we've talked about on here a lot, that these movements are constant throughout American history. The question is what we do to not allow them to augment and continue to, as you point out, have actual elected members of Congress that are attending their meetings. So after, in light of January 6th, like, what was it like for you to watch that happen?
Well, I happened to be in Santa Fe, New Mexico on that day. And I was kind of watching what was going on around the Capitol. In Santa Fe, because of where it's located, geographically, it draws extremists from Arizona and Texas. Like Santa Fe, New Mexico is a blue state. Santa Fe is a very liberal city, but because of where it's located, it draws pretty healthy crowds of militia groups and others. And at the same time that I was watching what was going on at the Capitol in DC, I was seeing guys with Trump flags and semi-automatic rifles marching through the streets of downtown Santa Fe saying, come out, we're taking the Capitol building. And for about 2 hours there, I was thinking to myself, is this actually happening? Like this, is this about to happen? Are they about to stun? I was looking at the footage in Austin and Phoenix and in Wyoming and in Olympia, Washington and in Michigan and Idaho. And I was like, is this about to actually happen? Like we used to sit around the Southern Poverty Law Center and be like, what would it actually take for these guys to go hot? Like, what would it actually take? How many of them are really willing to kill and die, based on what they say they believe in? And what would it take for them to get the momentum to actually carry out a revolution, as they would describe it? And for a couple hours there, I was pretty scared, And then I just watched them just sort of fizzle out. And since then, honestly, I'm both alarmed, but I'm actually also relieved. I tend to think that the ones that think that they blew their best shot, I don't think they're going to have a better shot than that. They had a cause in trying to keep Trump in office. Now we know that he was trying to maneuver the Justice Department, or there was even forces within the Justice Department that were willing to support that. They're never going to have a better opportunity, I think, to actually take over the US government than they had on January 6, 2021. That said, we're simultaneously have never been, I think, at a more dangerous moment in regards to right-wing terrorism in this country, because there are elements within that movement that recognize that they had a shot, they blew it, and they are desperate right now to try and get it back.
Mm.
Yeah. And you also saw, interestingly, a sharp division since January 6th between the sort of the Proud Boys and the sort of Gamergate incel sort of wing of this movement that were let's stand down, let's not do anything, guys, let's play the long game. And then the militias and the out and out white supremacist groups that were we have to move, now before Trump leaves office. And they lost. They couldn't keep the momentum going to carry out the planned armed takeovers of the state capitals on that Sunday that followed. The momentum fizzled.
So I have a couple. I mean, that's just, the insights are amazing, David, and thank you for sharing with us and our viewers. I was watching, and again, back when we worked together, I work primarily on economic justice now, Social Security works, expanding benefits. So in that time, it was different, right? I'd never gone undercover with white nationalist groups. I brought you on board, and I was introduced to you by another amazing journalist, Alex Zaitchek, right? That's how I was introduced to you. And then you showed me a lot of this stuff. And I only read charging documents during that part of my life, right? Now I don't have to do that anymore. And I'm happy about that. It actually is very psychically taxing,
yes,
to be that close to violence all the time. But reading charging documents, this one thing would jump out at me all the time. And I've read so many. I read Al-Qaeda stuff. I read militia stuff, right? There were active bombing. There's a MLK march where neo-Nazi put a bomb. It would have been a huge mass casualty event. It just didn't go off. There's a bunch of these things. And something always jumped out at me. I was like, look, yes, law enforcement, super important on different things. But generally, what actually keeps us safe is that the people who want to commit mass violence are super dumb and they just fumble the ball in like extraordinary ways, which means when somebody is moderately not dumb and wants to commit violence, they are super dangerous, which then leads to the other side, which is like, man, are we lucky, right? We are lucky so often that it's just a razor's edge. And one side would have been just mass violence, and the other side, you know, the bomb didn't go off because he didn't connect the wire correctly. The dumb part is like people go to gun ranges and are like, hey, I need automatic weapons because I'm going to go shoot up a building. And people are like, okay, if you wait right here. Like that literally was a charging document that I read. He went and he thought he could just ask for, and right, January 6th was the luck side. It was not the dumb side, because you actually had some extremely capable actors who were incredibly organized. Not the dude with no shirt on and the horns. That guy's a patsy. They surrounded themselves with patsies, but there was a core of militia trained, hyper violent, extremely well-armed people, and they had weapons caches all around the city. Right. For if it went off, they were ready. They were ready for full-scale war. And there's two moments when the woman climbs through the window and is shot dead. That's one. That's the police officer who did that stopped that motion from turning into a bloodbath on the House side. On the Senate side, because right past those doors is all the members of Congress hiding, you know, caught in little church pews, and a crowd baying for blood, right? And they would have gotten in. And again, the goal is just violence, kill people so that they can't turn back, right? The idea was the die is cast. And they called this, they had a hashtag, cross the Rubicon, right? Like cross the Rubicon, Trump. And when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, that's when the Republic fell. That's what they were aiming for.
I'm so tired of white nationalists ruining Latin for me, okay? As a classics nerd, I'm sick of it. I'm sorry, continue. I just want to point that out, though.
Ted Cruz tried to put himself as Cicero in the Catalan conspiracy. And I'm like, you're Catalan, bro. You're Catalan. Sulla is Trump. Like, you're not Cicero. We're not going to remember you for centuries. We will forget you soon. But
please, so soon.
The Senate side, David, was that luck piece. I mean, incredible bravery by the Capitol Police officer. But I'm sure you saw this. The extremists are coming up the stairs, and there's goobers mixed in, right? Like patsies. So it's not like, but there are the hyper violent core. They're coming up, and then he pushes him. He pushes the guy in the front, because if they turned right, that was where dozens of senators were, right? And they could have killed one. I mean, what would have happened if just one senator had died? You think they would have completed the vote that night? But they could have killed dozens of senators. The entire, basically everyone who is in line to become the president was there that day. That's why they chose that day. It was actually a planned.
No, it was planned. Their plan was to take hostages and, if necessary, execute
them.
The hardcore organized militia and what we call operationally capable white nationalists that had gotten together to form a plot to actually carry out that armed takeover of the U.S. Capitol, take hostages, and if necessary, if their demands weren't met, execute them. I mean, they were looking for the hostages. They just couldn't find them.
Yeah.
Now, you're quite right. What was different between January 6th and Unite the Right in Charlottesville, that in Unite the Right, most of them were like card-carrying right-wing extremists. It was like the Pan-Aryan gathering, right? But they were all like hate groups and extremist groups. On January 6th in the Capitol, you had those hardcore members, but they were sort of augmented by QAnon believers and just sort of Trumpistas in general, right? They didn't really know what the plan was, but they were certainly willing to storm the Capitol. And had the plan been carried out, how many of them would have supported it? I think probably quite a few would have been.
And also, but isn't in the extremist ideology, the idea is also to force people to make a decision, right? Like to put it to a place where you can't turn back, to break it so that you can't put it back together. So the plan was violence. Like if they could get it to pop off, that's what they are always saying, right? Like when it pops off, they're going to be ready. And then they had, guns and IEDs. And the fact that they placed 2 pipe bombs, one at the RNC and one at the DNC, to draw the Capitol Police away from the Capitol. That's insurgent tactics. You read about that from Afghanistan and fighting Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces, right? Or Saddam Hussein's Secret Service and Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Like these are the same tactics that they used. I want to throw one out there that I don't know where your read is on this one, but I believe that I saw enough to conclude that there was actual complicity from law enforcement, from obviously from the Trump appointees, right? The acting Defense Department, right? Like not letting the National Guard go out. But I actually think the Capitol Police as well, they had all this intelligence. And you read now, the officers on the line, they were expecting a protest like when Jocelyn and I show up and protest, right? They were expecting, we sit down and we get arrested and we walk with them.
Pull our arms out for the zip ties and whatnot.
But it took a really long time for the cavalry to arrive. The cavalry didn't arrive until it was basically over in the sense that it was starting to fizzle out. They'd gotten the senators and Congress people out of the building. There weren't any hostages to take. And then the cavalry, it's very suspicious to me. And again, like the good news is they can't plan something that big without word leaking, okay? Like on multiple fronts. But word had leaked and the proper authorities had been notified of exactly what they were intending. And yet they were able to carry it out within just a couple of like twists of fate away from being successful with what they planned. So I hope it's unearthed how they were able to pull that off, because there had to be some complicity at some levels of law enforcement and government authority. Had to be, because they were warned, So
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, same.
Jocelyn and I have been to the Capitol multiple times, fighting for healthcare, right? Like generally when we're fighting, it's we want healthcare. That's why I just despise the both siderism. We want to give people healthcare. They want to kill a sizable percentage of the American population, and the media is like, I can't tell the difference.
Well, and I think this is really important because Alex and I have been at pretty much every major action for the past 5, 10. In your case, how many years? I'm not going to age you. It's not the point. These are like protests populated by like high school English teachers and retirees who are coming to advocate for their own rights and their social security.
Let me interrupt, Jocelyn, because David doesn't know this. You were there when Bill Berg gassed you, right? Like tell David about that and the response of what that felt like compared to when there was an insurrection.
It was, we've discussed this on here a couple of times. It was surreal. We're in Lafayette Square with a bunch of students and really like really young and really older people, which is how peaceful leftist activists tend to be, you know, students, that sort of person, but no one even mildly intimidating, and they just start shooting at us. It's insane. They clearly have the manpower to control a group of people that are gathering. It's really interesting, the groups that they choose to control. And by interesting, I mean quite obviously complicit in the white supremacy ones. Right. But I mean, the problem for me watching this all play out is how short the attention span of the internet can be, which I understand as an internet lover and a person with a short attention span, but we can't pretend that this is a blip or that this is this weird memeable thing that happened. And that's why, David, I so appreciate your work and everything. It gives us a context of how this evolves and how it's going to keep evolving. Because I think it's way too tempting, and I don't know what the word is, because I don't want to call it delusional. I understand why people want to move on from the Trump era, but the problems we're discussing didn't begin in the Trump era, and they're not going to end with it. I mean, how do you guys deal with that when you talk to people about this?
Keeping a sense of humor helps me. I mean, one of the things, yeah, because, okay, here's something really funny about Trump is that there were a lot of white nationalists and neo-Nazis that were really they really had a problem with the fact that he let his daughter marry a Jewish man. They could never—
Wait, what? Seriously?
They could never really quite completely get down with him because of that. And this has gone unnoticed, but I'll just point it out, is that Trump pardoning Lil Wayne destroyed his reputation in large segments of the white nationalists, the white supremacists, and even the militia movements. Lil Wayne stands for everything that they are against, and Trump pardoning Lil Wayne.
And not the coup
right.
participants, right?
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. Right. I know, but so we keeping a sense of humor is just imperative, I think.
Let me ask you, just David, you don't actually do this work full time anymore, right? I mean, no,
the last time I went undercover was right after Unite the Right. I sort of came out of retirement once and went undercover at a rally in Knoxville, Tennessee, and it was the first time that I'd done anything like that since 2011, about 6 years. Yeah, and I almost. Go ahead.
So that's a part of how you deal with it, right? Is that when we work together, and I have the neo-Nazi fatwa. It's a death warrant for David.
Yeah.
And the federal authorities told you that it was real, that you had to take action because you were under threat. Like that was a real thing. And it was hard for me to understand how you could do it and for so long.
Yeah.
And
hard way. Go ahead.
And so it actually was quite I as colleagues, but also I consider you my friend, and I was like, how is he going to keep doing this? So it made me happy when you went into producing television and a different career path, but you're still ideologically where you are, and I feel like you're fighting it on this cultural power front where you can, but it's really sort of BS to demand for the progressive movement to demand that you're the only one. There's SPLC, ADL, there are organizations doing it, but it's so hard to just see this, especially knowing that it's Cassandra right? You're like, who could have foreseen it coming? And you're like, literally anyone who was paying attention. Right. And that's demoralizing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, back to when I was at media, I sort of figured out not to knock Media Matters, but I found out the hard way that doing that kind of work without the security apparatus of the Southern Poverty Law Center around me was an entirely different sort of undertaking, I mean, Media Matters doesn't have squadrons of armed guards, on notice 24/7 to scramble to your house if you're under threat. And I sort of found out that I couldn't really do it on my own. And also I just like started to find out that when I was undercover, I was scared. And when you're scared, you can't really do that work effectively.
But it's bizarre to me to hear that there is a way that you could do that work and not be scared. Because I was that, like the stuff at Media Matters was maybe like a little less spicy sometimes than some of the stuff that you'd done previously. But like, I remember this time you went to the machine gun shoot, and which is this huge gun show, outdoor gun show where you can shoot automatic weapons, which is super fun, I'm sure. But it's also, and importantly, we weren't there because there's guns there, like they're allowed to do the guns. It also is like table upon table upon table of Nazi paraphernalia and Confederate paraphernalia and all this stuff. I'm sure you remember this. We didn't have the cell phones at the time to use our shtick of like, oh, I'm just on the phone. So we had the little handheld camera, and you were filming this dude's Nazi stuff. I can't remember how it went down, but he got in your face, and this is a very all the guns. Do you remember that incident? I mean, like,
no, I do. I was able to play it off. I mean,
by being like, this is my phone.
Right. I had a flip cam. Remember those? I had a flip cam. That's what I was using.
But the way you played it off was you just told him you were obviously filming his shit, and you're like, nope, I'm not filming.
Well, I just was like, oh no, it's just because I think all this stuff is so cool. I want to be able to like, show it to my friends back in Alaska.
But I don't understand how you could do that stuff and not get scared, because you could get murdered at any moment in a location where you don't have any friends. They would all see that as as good, right? Like as eliminating you as a threat as good. So this is a very long-winded thank you for the work that you've done, because it is amazing to be able to see behind the curtain and see what these guys are actually planning. Do you have any stuff you want to talk about with your current work?
Oh, well, after I left Media Matters, I started basically making documentaries, and was very fortunate in the timing in that was really as all the streamers started to come online, and there's more sort of public appetite for nonfiction storytelling in documentary form, now than ever before. So I make docs now. One that's out right now is Night Stalker on Netflix, and I also had one that I'm especially proud of called The Last Narc, that's on Amazon. That's about the drug war in Mexico in the 1980s, and I think really nails down the CIA's involvement with the drug cartels in Mexico during that time. So I'm still doing ideologically driven work, but it still feels to me like investigative reporting and storytelling. It feels very much like the same skill set.
It is, and I just say, like, I watched Night Stalker. Last Narc is on my watch list. I just had to do some comedy after Night Stalker, not gonna lie, David. Had to do Pretend It's a City, because like it's the same thing, man. Your pen and your work on things. I mean, this is amazing investigative journalism in a video output. I wanted to put out there that everyone should watch Night Stalker, unless it'll give you horrible nightmares and you won't be able to sleep. But the work that you're doing right now is just super compelling. And it sort of has that same Holthausian magic to it. So I want people to know that they can do that. They can watch Night Stalker. You got to Google Barbecue Nations and read that. I think is one of your best. I don't know. I wanted to maybe end with this question. Where do you see it going? You've watched it, you've exposed so much of it. What do you see those two factions? Let me put out what I think might happen, and you tell me where you are. I think that it was a huge crowd. January 6th was the zenith. And after January 6th, it shrinks a little, but it becomes more violent because the people who are in the core don't leave. and then they're going to commit more violence, and it'll shrink more but become more violent, and that is a cycle, and I feel like we have to help shrink it, and then law enforcement are the folks who can help keep it from perpetrating violence, but we have to cut off, we being the progressive movement, the ability for these members of Congress and supposed serious people to hobnob with Nazis.
Right. Where I see it going, I think that we're in real danger of another large-scale attack on the scope of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. That's A. B is, I think we're going to see a gravitation of right-wing extremism and white nationalist violence down on the border. I see immigration is going to become an animating force for them again, in the same way that it was for most of the 2000s. I think that we're going to see a real resurgence of the armed border vigilante movement. These guys love to play army, and that's a good space for them to do that. And so they can go down and like actually have encampments and wear all the gear and stuff. And I think that's probably where it's headed, is back down to the border, along with what they call, internal enforcement acts. So acts of violence and intimidation, targeting non-white immigrants throughout the country. But I think especially we're going to see a big uptick in border vigilante violence and them rallying around the cause of, completing Trump's wall with, armed vigilante efforts. Yeah, that's where I see it going.
Well, David, I really can't thank you enough for all the work you've done and continue to do. I mean, it's so important, and it's irreplaceable, this kind of information and writing. And you are also a fabulous writer, which,
thank you.
You ever meet people where like you like what they're saying, but they can't write, and so it creates this weird intellectual dissonance? Yeah. I have that problem a lot. But anyways, you're lovely. We're so happy to have you, and thank you for being with us today. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there anything else you want people to know before we close out?
No.
Good. All right, whatever. Thank you for being with us, David. This was really, really informative and a very dark topic, but I feel like I learned a ton, and I'm sure everyone watching learned a ton. So
great.
Thank you so much, David. Yep. So Jocelyn, that's some pretty heavy stuff, right?
Yeah.
He's amazing though, right? Like,
I mean, you ever meet people and you're like, oh, like this is why writing and journalism matters, Not that I ever forget that, but it's so important. And I know this might seem tangential, but it doesn't. Like, information, communication, what we know, how we talk about these things can feel abstract. It can feel ethereal, but it's not. Having this information, being knowledgeable, being educated, and having a sense of what's happening, these are life or death issues that we're talking about. And people die when we're ignorant about it, when we forget about it, when we let it. I mean, Timothy McVeigh, how many people died in the Oklahoma City bombing? A lot.
A lot.
Like a
children.
Yeah.
Daycare was, directly on top of the bomb. And I think, I'm serious though, people who are watching this should just go read David's work. I sent a bunch of links to Jocelyn before this show, and she read them. So like you can attest, it's amazing. It's amazing what he exposed, and also like the situations he was in. And I don't think I got out what I meant of how much rests on, we as a movement rely on like individuals to do just so much more than we should be asking them to do. We shouldn't be asking people to carry all of this weight on their own, but we actually do ask people to do that, and people do it. But something you said about journalism, I mean, Holthouse's story absolutely shows like, private equity is just destroying journalism before our eyes. And like, if it wasn't, we ask these truth tellers to get paid super low wages to tell the truth about what's actually going on. And there's enormous pressure for them to just shut up, right? Or to get behind a paywall, or to toe a company line that is not truthful. David said the border is going to be the animating issue for the extremists. Well, right now I listen to right-wing radio just to see where people are still. And that's all they're talking about. So like the mainstream voices, the Ben Shapiro's and the Brian Kilmeades, are talking about, border invasion, the caravans, stopping building the wall, destroyed all these American jobs. Like, that's what they're doing. It's this dialectic that the right wing has, and we are sort of asking people individually to fight back against this movement, of this well-financed movement, because on top are these billionaires who are dropping money. I don't know if you saw the Rebecca Mercer, dropping money onto the January 6th organizations. $500,000 in Bitcoin came over to these people. Like, they make money doing it. That's why they do it. That's why you see so many of these narcs who, start sort of as left-ish, usually failed comedians and types like that. And then they realize that the paymasters are on the right. And so they do this algorithmic shift over to the right. And the media landscape is a fire hose of Nazi propaganda because of it. And to fight back against that, we often ask you, me, other people to be like, well, just do it for the movement, and there are huge funders funding things. I'm just complaining now, but that's what I feel a lot when I worked with Holthouse, was that, like, the demand was unfair, because it shouldn't be on individuals to do this. So just, again, what it should be is we need to be organized. We need to be in solidarity, and we need to understand that this Nazi movement is not going anywhere. And we're going to be fighting it for a long time, and we have to win.
Yeah, well, I have both a lot to add to that and perhaps too much, to where it would take us well past the noon o'clock stop time. But yes, I love Alex. I mean, we are so used to ruggedly brave individuals, and I don't like that either. I don't think we should take that for granted. I don't think we should expect it of people. I think we should have structures which hold people accountable and create truth, structures which are in line with human truth. And why was this allowed to happen? Why were these white supremacy groups allowed to expand and gain traction when we've known about them for a very long time? Brad DM'd me, 168 people died in the Oklahoma City bomb and 700 injured. Like, these are not small numbers. These are not the way the media frames it. It's like, oh, there's like crazy skinheads killed this one guy. No. Thousands of people are killed by these groups. And it's, obviously, how do you quantify the damage they do in other ways when they infect the culture and the political sphere and when they're allowed to legislate? But now I'm just complaining. I apologize. Today was a really great show. I learned a lot, and I really love you all for being here. Thank you. Keep watching. Stay organized. Don't be a white supremacist. And as always, through solidarity, we can do all things. And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.